The moment they called me, just a secretary, in front of the entire executive team, they had no idea they were dismissing their own board chair. What started as corporate humiliation became the most satisfying boardroom revelation in company history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I adjusted my reading glasses for the 15th time that morning, scanning the quarterly budget report spread across my modest desk in the corner of Meridian Corporation's executive floor. The numbers didn't add up. They never did when Marcus Whitfield was involved. As Senior Vice President of Operations, Marcus had a talent for making millions disappear into strategic initiatives that existed only on paper. Sarah Chen, our Chief Financial Officer, rushed past my desk, clutching a stack of files, her heels clicking against the marble floor in sharp, anxious beats. She paused, glancing at the budget analysis I'd been working on since dawn. "Emma, have you finished the executive summary for the board presentation?" she asked, though we both knew she meant had I finished writing the summary she'd present as her own work. "It's ready," I replied, sliding the perfectly formatted document across my desk. "But Sarah, there are some discrepancies in the operational spending that might need addressing before. The board doesn't need to get bogged down in minor details," she interrupted, already walking away. "Just make sure the coffee is ready by 9. The presentation is too important for distractions." I watched her disappear into the elevator, my carefully researched analysis dismissed as easily as yesterday's newspaper. For 3 years, I'd been Emma Parker, the quiet secretary who kept everyone's schedules, organized their meetings, and apparently, according to them, had no business understanding complex financial matters. If only they knew. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian's downtown headquarters, casting long shadows across the executive floor. I'd arrived at 6:30, as I did every morning, using my keycard to access areas most employees never saw. My colleagues assumed I was simply dedicated to my secretarial duties. The truth was far more complicated. 10 years ago, my grandmother Eleanor Parker had been one of 3 founding partners of Meridian Corporation. She'd built the company from a small consulting firm into a multinational powerhouse worth over $2 billion. When she passed away 5 years ago, she left me something more valuable than money: control. Through a complex web of trusts and holding companies, I owned 51% of Meridian Corporation. The board position came with it, though I'd never taken my seat publicly. Instead, I'd chosen to work anonymously within the company, watching, learning, and growing increasingly disturbed by what I discovered. The executives who dismissed me daily had no idea they answered to me. My nameplate read E. Parker Administrative Assistant, but my real title was Chairman of the Board. It was a secret I'd guarded carefully, using it only to quietly influence major decisions through carefully worded suggestions from the board to management. But watching Marcus Whitfield systematically drain company resources while treating employees like disposable assets was testing my patience. Today's board meeting would be particularly interesting, though none of them suspected why. "Emma?" Marcus's voice boomed across the executive floor like a warning siren. "Where's my presentation folder? The board meeting starts in 20 minutes and I can't find anything." I walked over to his corner office, noting how he'd managed to scatter papers across every surface despite having 3 assistants. His presentation folder sat exactly where I'd placed it the night before, centered on his desk with a sticky note marked Board Meeting. "It's right here, Marcus," I said calmly, pointing to the obvious folder. He snatched it up without acknowledgement, then paused, looking at me with the expression of someone who'd just remembered something unpleasant. "Actually, Emma, I need you to sit in on today's board meeting. Take notes, handle any logistics. Sarah's assistant called in sick, and we need someone reliable." My heart rate quickened, though I kept my expression neutral. Attending the board meeting as Emma Parker, secretary, while secretly being the board's chair, was a scenario I'd never imagined. It was also an opportunity I couldn't pass up. "Of course," I replied. "Should I prepare anything specific?" "Just your usual efficiency," he said dismissively. "The board doesn't need to be impressed by staff. They need to see that management has everything under control. If he only knew how wrong he was about that." The boardroom occupied the entire top floor of Meridian Tower, its polished mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that had witnessed decades of million-dollar decisions. Normally, I participated in these meetings remotely, my votes cast through my attorney James Mitchell, who served as my proxy on the board. But today, James was conveniently, quote, delayed by traffic, leaving the board one member short. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd orchestrated his absence specifically to observe this meeting from the inside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the executives filed in, I positioned myself at a small table near the coffee service, notepad ready. Invisible, as always. The board members took their seats. Margaret Sullivan, former CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Robert Hayes, a venture capitalist with decades of experience. Diana Foster, a corporate attorney. And Thomas Graham, a financial analyst whose reputation for detecting fraud was legendary. They nodded politely at me, the helpful secretary, having no idea I was their missing colleague. Marcus took his place at the head of the table, his confidence radiating through his expensive suit and practiced smile. Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to present our Q3 results and outline our expansion strategy for the coming year. He launched into his presentation, clicking through slides filled with impressive graphs and optimistic projections. Everything looked perfect on the surface. Revenue growth, market expansion, increased efficiency. But I knew the real numbers, the ones hidden in subsidiary accounts and shell companies he'd created to mask his embezzlement. Our operational costs have decreased by 12%, Marcus announced proudly, while maintaining full-service quality across all departments. Margaret Sullivan leaned forward. That's impressive, Marcus. How did you achieve such significant cost reductions? I held my breath, knowing exactly how those savings had been generated. Strategic restructuring, Marcus replied smoothly. We eliminated redundancies and streamlined processes. Sometimes tough decisions lead to better outcomes. What he didn't mention were the 43 employees he'd laid off from the customer service department, forcing the remaining staff to handle double workloads for the same pay. Or the facility maintenance cuts that had resulted in 2 minor workplace accidents. Or the employee training programs he'd canceled, keeping the budget money for his personal, quote, consulting fees. Robert Hayes studied his copy of the financial report. These numbers are certainly encouraging, but I'd like to understand the breakdown of operational expenses. Some of these line items seem unusually high. My pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of scrutiny Marcus had been avoiding. Emma, Marcus called out, not bothering to turn around. Could you get us fresh coffee? And perhaps some of those pastries from the cafe downstairs? It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. He wanted me out of the room while he deflected the board's financial questions. Of course, I replied, standing gracefully. But instead of leaving immediately, I walked slowly toward the door, close enough to hear his response. Robert, I appreciate your attention to detail, Marcus was saying, but these are routine operational expenses. My team and I have thoroughly reviewed every aspect of our spending. I can assure you, every dollar is accounted for and properly allocated. I paused at the door, pretending to check my notes while listening to what would be, if I had anything to say about it, the last lie Marcus Whitfield told in this boardroom. As I stepped into the hallway, my mind was already racing ahead to the afternoon's revelations. The board members thought they were dealing with a competent executive, presenting solid quarterly results. They had no idea they were about to discover they'd been systematically defrauded by someone who viewed their secretary as nothing more than a coffee-fetching accessory. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I allowed myself a small smile. Marcus Whitfield was about to learn that dismissing the wrong person could have consequences he never imagined. 20 minutes later, I returned with a tray of coffee and pastries, my expression as neutral and professional as always. The board members thanked me politely. Margaret even complimented the pastry selection, while Marcus barely acknowledged my presence. As I was saying, Marcus continued, our expansion into the European market represents a tremendous opportunity. We've already identified 3 potential acquisition targets that would give us immediate market presence. Diana Foster, the corporate attorney, reviewed her notes carefully. These acquisitions would require significant capital investment. Do we have the liquidity for such expansion? Absolutely, Marcus replied confidently. Our cash reserves are stronger than they've been in years, thanks to our operational improvements. I almost choked on my own breath. Meridian's cash reserves were actually at their lowest point in 5 years, depleted by Marcus's creative accounting schemes. The money he claimed was available for expansion had been systematically transferred to accounts he controlled personally. Thomas Graham, the fraud detection specialist, tapped his pen against his portfolio. Marcus, I'd like to schedule a comprehensive audit of these operational improvements. When you achieve cost reductions this significant, it's important to ensure they're sustainable long-term. The color drained from Marcus's face, though he recovered quickly. Of course, Thomas. Transparency is always our priority, though I should mention that extensive auditing can sometimes disrupt operational efficiency. Perhaps we could schedule it for next quarter, after we've completed the European expansion planning? Actually, Thomas replied, I think the audit should happen before any major expansion. We need to understand our true financial position before making significant new investments. I watched Marcus's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This was the kind of scrutiny he'd been carefully avoiding, and I could see him calculating how to deflect or delay any serious financial review. Emma, he called out again, this time with a slight edge to his voice. Could you step outside and call my assistant? Tell her I need the Henderson contract files brought up immediately. Another dismissal. Another attempt to have sensitive conversations without the staff present. But this time I had a different response prepared. Actually, Marcus, I said quietly, rising from my chair, I think it would be better if I stayed for the rest of the meeting. The room went silent. Marcus stared at me as if I'd just spoken in a foreign language. Excuse me? He said, his voice carrying a warning that would have intimidated most employees. I said, I think I should stay. I repeated, my voice calm but clear. There are some things the board needs to know about those operational improvements you've been discussing. Marcus's face flushed red. Emma, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're way out of line here. You're a secretary, not a board advisor. Please step outside immediately. The board members looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure how to handle this unprecedented breach of corporate protocol. Margaret Sullivan cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should take a short recess, she suggested. No, I said firmly, surprising myself with my own boldness. What I have to say can't wait. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. Emma, you're fired. Security will escort you out of the building immediately. This is completely unacceptable behavior. I looked around the room at the board members, these successful, intelligent people who had no idea what was really happening in their own company. Then I looked back at Marcus, this man who had dismissed me, stolen from the company, and damaged countless lives through his greed and arrogance. Actually, Marcus, I said, reaching into my briefcase and pulling out a folder I'd prepared months ago for exactly this moment. You can't fire me, because you don't work for me. I turned to face the board members, my heart pounding but my voice steady. My name is Emma Parker, and I'm the majority shareholder of Meridian Corporation. I'm also your missing board chair. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning system humming through the walls. Margaret Sullivan's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. Robert Hayes's pen fell from his fingers onto the mahogany table. Diana Foster stared at me as if I'd just claimed to be from another planet. Marcus laughed. Actually laughed out loud. Emma, I don't know what kind of breakdown you're having, but this fantasy has gone far enough. Security? But Thomas Graham was studying my folder with the intensity of someone who recognized authentic documentation when he saw it. Wait, he said slowly. Margaret, didn't Eleanor Parker own the controlling stake in Meridian? And didn't her ownership transfer to a family trust after she passed away? Yes, Margaret replied uncertainly. But the trustee has always participated remotely through legal representation. We've never met. You've never met her, I corrected gently. But you've been working with me for 3 years. Every major decision, every strategic shift, every policy change, they all came through James Mitchell, my attorney. But they originated with me. I opened my folder and began distributing copies of documents I'd prepared: trust agreements, ownership certificates, voting records, and most importantly, a complete financial analysis of Marcus's embezzlement schemes. For the past 18 months, I continued, I've been documenting systematic financial fraud within this company. Marcus has been using shell corporations and dummy consulting contracts to steal approximately $2.3 million from Meridian's operational budget. Marcus's laughter died abruptly. This is insane. Emma is clearly having some kind of mental health crisis. These documents are obviously forged. But Diana Foster, the corporate attorney, was already examining the paperwork with professional precision. These look legitimate, she said quietly. The trust documentation matches what we have on file, and the signatures appear authentic. Thomas Graham was studying the financial analysis, his expression growing darker with each page. Marcus, these shell companies listed here, weren't these the consulting firms you've been using for our efficiency improvements? The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus looked around the table, seeing his confident presentation dissolving into a nightmare he couldn't control. I can explain everything, he said desperately. Emma has obviously been gathering information inappropriately, possibly illegally. We should be discussing her breach of confidentiality, not entertaining these ridiculous accusations. Actually, I said, opening my laptop and connecting it to the presentation screen, let me show you exactly how Marcus has been improving our operational efficiency. The screen filled with bank records, transfer documents, and email trails that painted a clear picture of systematic theft. Shell companies created with Marcus as the sole beneficiary. Consulting contracts for services never performed. Vendor payments to non-existent businesses that funneled money directly into Marcus's personal accounts. This is impossible, Marcus stammered. How could a secretary possibly have access to this level of financial information? Margaret Sullivan answered before I could. Because she's not a secretary, Marcus. She's the owner of the company. The weight of revelation settled over the room like fog. The board members stared at me with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and growing anger. Not at me, but at the situation they'd unknowingly allowed to develop. Emma, Robert Hayes said carefully, if this is true, why didn't you reveal your identity sooner? Why work as an administrative assistant? I looked around the room at these people who had been my colleagues without knowing it, who had politely thanked me for coffee while I secretly guided their major decisions. Because I wanted to understand this company from the ground up, I replied. I wanted to see how decisions made in this boardroom affected the people who actually make Meridian successful. And I wanted to identify problems that might not be visible from the executive level. I gestured toward the financial documents now spread across the mahogany table. Problems like Marcus's systematic theft of company resources. Problems like the 43 employees he laid off to hide his embezzlement. Problems like the safety issues he created by cutting maintenance budgets while padding his own accounts. Thomas Graham looked up from the financial analysis, his face grim. Emma, how much total damage are we looking at? Including opportunity costs and the money spent covering up his schemes. Approximately $4 million over 18 months, I replied. But the real damage is to employee morale, company culture, and our reputation in the industry. Marcus had gone very quiet, his earlier bluster replaced by the pale, desperate look of someone watching their world collapse in real time. He knew the evidence was overwhelming, but he made one last attempt to deflect blame. Even if Emma is who she claims to be, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, she's been operating under false pretenses. She's been spying on employees, gathering information deceptively. Surely that raises ethical questions about her leadership. Diana Foster looked up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing. Actually, Marcus, as the majority owner, Emma has every legal right to monitor company operations in any way she deems appropriate. What she doesn't have the right to do is embezzle company funds. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was never in doubt. By the time we adjourned, Marcus Whitfield had been stripped of all corporate positions, his access revoked, and criminal charges recommended to the district attorney's office. As the board members filed out, each stopping to apologize for not recognizing me sooner, I remained seated at the small table near the coffee service, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Margaret Sullivan was the last to leave. She paused at my table, looking at me with something between admiration and concern. "Emma, what happens now?" she asked. "Will you take your rightful place as board chair?" I looked around the empty boardroom, thinking about the employees downstairs who still didn't know their jobs were secure, about the systemic changes that needed to happen, about the responsibility that came with power, and the importance of using it wisely. "Yes," I said finally, "but first, I have some people to rehire, and some apologies to make." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the executive floor, I walked back to my small desk in the corner, where my nameplate still read, E. Parker, Administrative Assistant. Tomorrow, that would change. But today had proven that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone assumes has no power at all. The revolution had begun, and it started with a secretary who was never just a secretary at all. The following morning, I arrived at Meridian Tower, knowing that everything had changed, yet nothing looked different. The same marble lobby, the same security guards nodding politely as I badged in, the same elevator carrying me to the executive floor. But this time, I wasn't Emma Parker, the invisible secretary. I was Emma Parker, chairman of the board, and the weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a mantle I'd been unconsciously preparing to wear for 3 years. My first stop wasn't my small corner desk, but the HR department on the 15th floor. Patricia Williams, our head of human resources, looked up from her computer with surprise when I knocked on her open door. "Emma, what brings you down here so early?" she asked, gesturing for me to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk. "Patricia, I need you to prepare reinstatement paperwork for 43 employees," I said, placing a detailed list on her desk. "These are the people Marcus laid off over the past 18 months. I want them contacted today and offered their positions back with full back pay and benefits." James Davidson, our head of operations, cleared his throat nervously. "So, Emma, what exactly does this mean for the rest of us? Are there going to be more terminations?" I looked around the table at these people I'd worked alongside for 3 years. People who'd treated me with varying degrees of respect or dismissal. People who were now grappling with the reality that their secretary had been their ultimate boss all along. "It means we're going to rebuild this company the right way," I said. "It means we're going to create a culture where people are valued for their contributions, not their job titles. It means we're going to make decisions based on what's best for employees and customers, not what looks good in quarterly reports." Linda Rodriguez, our head of marketing, leaned forward. "Emma, I have to ask, were you gathering information on all of us this whole time? Should we be worried about what you observed?" Her question was fair, and I could see similar concerns in the faces around the table. They were wondering if I'd been building cases against them, collecting evidence of their mistakes or shortcomings. "I was observing," I admitted, "but not to build cases against anyone. I was trying to understand how decisions made at the executive level affected people throughout the company. I was learning about the disconnect between policy and practice." I pulled out my notebook, the same one I'd carried as a secretary, filled with observations and insights I'd gathered over 3 years. "For instance, James, do you remember the new efficiency protocols you implemented last year?" James nodded cautiously. "Yes, they reduced processing time by 15%. They also increased employee stress levels significantly," I continued. I watched customer service representatives work through lunch breaks to meet the new deadlines. I saw quality control inspectors skip safety checks to maintain processing speed. The efficiency looked good on paper, but it was creating problems you never saw from the executive level. The room was quiet as my words sank in. These were good people who'd been making decisions based on incomplete information, guided by a CEO who cared more about personal profit than sustainable success. "So what happens now?" Linda asked. "Now we fix it," I said. "We create systems that value both efficiency and employee well-being. We implement oversight that prevents future embezzlement. We rebuild trust with the people who make this company successful." "Sabrina," I called out, "could I speak with you for a moment?" She approached nervously, probably wondering if she'd done something wrong. "I've been impressed by your analytical thinking," I told her. Would you be interested in a position on our new Financial Oversight Committee? It would involve reviewing budget proposals and identifying potential inefficiencies or irregularities. Her eyes widened. You mean like preventing what Marcus did? Exactly like preventing what Marcus did, I confirmed. We need people who can think critically and aren't afraid to ask difficult questions. But I'm just an intern, she protested. I don't have the experience or credentials for that kind of responsibility. I smiled, remembering similar doubts I'd had 3 years ago when I first considered working anonymously within the company. Sabrina, 3 days ago, I was just a secretary. Experience and credentials matter, but so do fresh perspectives and the courage to speak up when something doesn't look right. As the day wound down, I finally sat alone at my small desk, looking at the nameplate that still read, E. Parker, Administrative Assistant. Tomorrow, I would move to the chairman's office on the top floor. I would attend board meetings as myself rather than as an invisible note-taker. I would make decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. But I would never forget what I learned sitting at this desk, in this corner, watching how power really operated when it thought no one important was looking. My phone buzzed with a text message from James Mitchell, my attorney who had served as my proxy on the board for 3 years. Saw the news coverage. Proud of you for stepping forward, ready to support the transition however you can. The news coverage. I hadn't even thought about how this story would play in the business media. By tomorrow, every major publication would be running articles about the secretary, who turned out to be the secret owner of a billion-dollar corporation. Some would focus on the corporate intrigue, others on the embezzlement scandal. But I hoped a few would understand the deeper story about the importance of listening to voices that often go unheard. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave the office, Patricia Williams appeared at my desk. Emma, I wanted to give you an update on the reinstatements, she said. We've reached 37 of the 43 people on your list. Every single one has accepted our offer to return. Most of them cried when I explained what had really happened. And the other 6? I asked. 4 have found new jobs they love and decided to stay where they are, but they thanked us for the offer. 1 has relocated across the country. And 1, she paused, consulting her notes. 1 said he'd never trust Meridian Corporation again, no matter who was in charge. I nodded, understanding his skepticism. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with a single gesture or phone call. It required consistent action over time. Patricia, make sure he knows that if he ever changes his mind, the offer stands. And see if we can provide positive references if he needs them for future opportunities. Already done, she replied with a smile. As I walked the elevator for the last time as Emma Parker, administrative assistant, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd chosen invisibility as a path to understanding. Today, I was stepping into full visibility with the knowledge I'd gained from existing at the margins. The elevator doors opened, revealing my reflection in the polished metal, the same person who'd ridden this elevator hundreds of times before, yet fundamentally transformed by the revelation of my true identity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Rebuilding company culture, implementing systemic changes, proving that leadership could be both powerful and humble. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years of secret observation and careful planning. I felt hope, not just for Meridian Corporation, but for the possibility that businesses could be forces for good when they valued all their people, listened to all their voices, and remembered that behind every job title was a human being with insights worth hearing. The revolution that began with a dismissed secretary had become something larger, a transformation based on the radical idea that everyone's contribution matters, regardless of where they sit in the organizational chart. As I stepped out into the evening air, I thought about all the other just secretaries and just interns and just assistants, working in companies around the world, watching, learning, understanding more than anyone realized. Perhaps my story would inspire some of them to speak up, to share their insights, to refuse to remain invisible when they had something important to contribute. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room really is the one everyone assumes has no power at all. And sometimes, the revolution begins with someone who was there all along, waiting for the right moment to stop being just anything, and start being everything they were meant to be. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.